author Anthony Burgess.
Long-winded intro, but... How are you again? It's
well.
You are?
Well, yes, I think, yes.
You always get me at the end of a week. If I seem a little punchy, it's always because at the end of a week of this kind of work, your mind begins to go.
Yes, well, it's the end of my week, too, you know.
That's right. Why should I think I'm the only one whose week is ending?
I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were here last time, we talked a little about Princeton, where you teach now.
Yes, indeed. Yes, we did. Yes.
Do you live right on the campus?
I live by the football stadium. They have a sort of game there where men come out wearing kind of Martian armor, and they play a kind of rugby football, but they play it the wrong way around. This is American football, I take it.
Oh, yes, that is American football.
I see.
It's very different from your own.
Well, they have bands playing, and I think they possibly have drum majorettes. Or this is Princeton, they may not, I don't know. But I am right by the camp, by the stadium. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a house that belongs to a Chinese professor of electrical engineering who's taking a sabbatical in Taiwan. Yeah. He's a professor of electrical engineering with his grandmother, grandfather, and 3 or 4 children, and all their books are there and all their clothes, and we're just camping out. I know he's a professor of electrical engineering because all the wiring is wrong. He knows exactly how far to let the wiring go before collapse occurs. And my small son was very nearly electrocuted the other day when putting a lamp on. It's an exciting house.
Must be. I mean, but all those Chinese books and all...
all the Chinese books there, and a lot of chopsticks, but nothing to eat steak with.
What, do you deal with the students directly these days? When I was in school, you didn't always have a great deal of contact with the professors that you wanted to. Can they come to you and ask you anything they want and bring their problems
well
to
they can come, but I'm ashamed of asking them in. I mean, there are no carpets on the floor and, you know, nowhere to hang coats. There's plenty of whiskey and that sort of thing, but nothing to drink it out of. I'm ashamed, so I usually meet them in a pub, but in the pub they say they're too young, and so we end up by meeting in the street and risk arrest.
By doing so, yeah. Well, do you deal with parents too?
I occasionally have parents who come from Detroit and other towns saying, you know, I've been in the timber business for a long time, and my father was in the timber business. My son wants to be a poet. Please stop him wanting to be a poet. And I say, you know, whether he's going to be a good poet or not is not the point. I'm here to try and persuade him to be a poet, so don't come to me.
How do they take that?
Well, they say as a rule that poets are a danger to the American community. Poets are anti-establishment. Poets are anti-Nixon and anti-Agnew, despite Agnew's immense vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And they feel that to be a poet is to be a sort of commie, I think is the term. And this is what they're scared of. Any free use of words, any use of words creatively, in a free zone as opposed to the kind of set groups of words we get on television commercials or in political speeches is dangerous. Free use of language is dangerous to a particular generation. And that's one aspect of the generation gap. The kids want to use words freely, want to invent, want to be poets, and the parents don't want this.
And were they offended when you said, I will not discourage this boy from being a poet?
Vaguely offended, yes. But after all, they're paying the fees, so they shouldn't be offended.
Yeah, I see. There is a rumor that you can speak Elizabethan English, and
yes,
the
indeed
way
I
it sounded,
can.
they say we never get to hear that, and it's very rare to get a guest who can do that.
Do you mean speak as Shakespeare spoke?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. You can actually do it if you want to suddenly start the conversation. And
yes,
you can do it.
Yes.
It's amazing.
The fact is that, you know, Shakespeare was born more than 400 years ago, and there were no gramophone records then, but we have a very accurate idea of the way they spoke in those days. Well, it's a long story, but if you take a word like mouse, M-O-U-S-E, we do know that the Anglo-Saxons pronounced that word moose because of the way they spelt it, M-U-S, and in Scotland they still say moose and hoose and so on. When the Normans came over in 1066, they changed the spelling of the word to M-O-U-S-E, which is a very French spelling, like strawberry mousse. The word was moose 1,000 years ago, and it's now mouse, so it has changed. So it's changed gradually, and if you tap in at about the year 1550, you can guess pretty accurately that it's probably something like moose, which is not far from Dublin English. And on the whole, you can say that the best person to speak Shakespeare, as he used to be spoken in his own day, would be a Third Avenue bartender, a combination of New York and Irish.
Why is that?
Well, America is a very conservative country. The language in America has hardly changed since 1620. Whereas in England, it had a terrific change about the year 1750. Whooshed forward. It got rid of all its R's, so instead of saying feature or creature, we just say creature, feature. We got rid of the R in the middle of a word and at the end of a word.
Why? Why does an R disappear from a language?
It's a very weak R. It's so weak in English that many Americans imagine that we don't say Paris, we say Paris. We don't, of course, we say Paris. Yeah. The R is so weak it becomes a murmur. And the murmur it turns into is the sound Whereas you say feature in the old days, feature, it becomes feature, The sound is kind of a substitute for an R.
But the R
it's a long story.
The R has disappeared from parts of America and not other parts.
In the south,
it's very hard
there
to hear.
There are very few R's in the south.
That's right.
But up here in the northeast, the R is pretty strong.
Now, anyway, why should that be? I don't understand. No one ever completely explains to me why it should be.
Nobody understands why languages change. They seem to change totally outside the realm of human control. We do know that about the time when Henry V was fighting at Agincourt, the language began to change very rapidly. We had what was called the Great Vowel Shift. And this word mouse that had been pronounced moose, at that point, began to change to something like mose. It was working down to mouse, you see. The tongue became tired of holding the long ooh sound. It began to waver and wobble. And instead of saying moose, it said moose. And it dropped down to ma and tried to get up again to oos. It didn't quite make it.
Where will it end?
Well,
where is it all going?
It can't go any further. You see, is about the bottom of the mouth, and ooh is the top of the mouth.
That's right.
And it can't do anything about that. But it explains why we say moon. You see, moon obviously is spelt with two O's.
Yes.
M-O-O-N, and that was obviously pronounced morn. And when the ooh words got out of the way, the O words got up there. Moon. And a word like road, R-O-A-D, roared, climbed up in the same way. Road, road, road. This climbing goes on all the time. We don't know why, but it does.
Well, civilization is sinking, the language is climbing.
That's right.
Maybe,
well, Shakespeare, piece of Shakespeare. You want some Shakespeare?
Would you?
Yes, indeed.
But first we must, unless you want to do the Ovaltine label in Elizabethan
what a good idea.
English.
Do I get paid for this?
You probably will if you do it right.
Chocolate flavor, special dietary information. One serving of Ovaltine provides these percentages of minimum daily adult requirements as established by the U.S. government. That'll do?
That's fine.
Ovaltine, the drink that is a food. Thank you.
That's as Shakespeare would have done it. And language, it just intrigues me. If I had nothing to do, I would study it in all its forms, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's your medium, isn't it? It's your medium.
My medium?
It's your medium, yes. But, sorry.
Well,
yes.
we were going to do some actual Shakespeare for us, the way that the people sitting there in the pit used to hear it.
Yes, indeed. Now, let's take Hamlet. I can't remember the whole soliloquy, to be or not to be, but you can be pretty sure, I kid you not, as they say, that what they heard in 1601 A.D. in London was something like this. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and boy oppose and end them. To die, to sleep no more, and boy asleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished.
Devoutly?
Devoutly to be wished.
That sounds like an Irishman from Nebraska.
It is that. It is.
It really does.
Well,
it sounds flat at one, and yet it sounds Irish.
Well, the way they speak in Dublin is the way they spoke when the English were ruling Dublin in the 1590s. The language hasn't changed since those days. When we talk about Irish speech, we don't mean the speech of Irishmen. We mean the speech of Englishmen in that period, which was transplanted to Dublin. So the say in a cup of tea is not Irish; it's pure English.
It is.
It's pure Elizabethan
That's probably insulting to the English to be told that.
Well, it's a fair signal. You see, when you see the letters EA in a word, S-E-A-T-E-A, that was a signal to the people of Shakespeare's time that they pushed the tongue down a bit and said te. You didn't say see the sea. You said see the say. You made a distinction between the two words, which we can no longer make. And a golf tee and a cup of tea, you see, were different again. Tea and te. Yeah. Very useful.
And so things that rhymed in Shakespeare don't rhyme now because certain words have changed.
Exactly. Well, there's a good example in, I'm sorry to be highbrow, in Henry IV, where Falstaff and Prince Henry are having a bit of an argument. And Prince Henry asks Falstaff for his reasons. What are your reasons? What are your reasons? And Falstaff said, reasons are as plentiful as blackberries. But of course, what he said was raisins are as plentiful as blackberries.
Oh,
and you get a pun there.
So it was a gag then.
It's a gag. Raisins are as
no
plentiful
joke.
as blackberries. No joke now.
maybe you can tell me what the source of it is. It's an anti-Irish remark made in the 19th century, and something tells me it was, I don't know why. Well, maybe I'll just tell it to you. I think it was someone was advising another world ruler what to do about the Irish problem. And the thing went, and this is where it started to break up last night. He said the answer to the settlement of the Irish question would be to have the Irish and the Dutch change countries. Then the Dutch would cultivate the land in Ireland and feed the world, whereas the Irish would neglect the dikes and drown themselves. And this would settle the Irish question. And
God, yes.
I wonder who would say a thing like that.
Well, you can work out who it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be Parnell. It wouldn't be Gladstone. It would be some Tory.
Was it Buddy Hackett, possibly? I just don't. A Tory.
I don't think anybody dare say that now.
Yeah.
It was the kind of thing that was said. It's a kind of Cromwellian remark.
It's pompous but witty, I guess you might say.
Yes, the Irish. I'm partly Irish myself. Are you?
I am too.
My grandmother was a Finnegan, so I feel strongly for the Irish. My grandmother was from Tipperary, and it's still there. The older I get, the more Irish I become. I'm told the more Irish I look, and this is something I have to get used to. I feel more like an Irishman. I feel less and less like an Englishman as I get older. It's as though the deep-buried blood is gradually rising to the surface.
How do you know if you're becoming more Irish? Because I'm quite Irish, and I was wondering if
I'm becoming, in a curious way, anti-Southern English. I'm a northerner, and I don't think Americans appreciate that, we have our division in that very small island, just as you have the division here, or used to have the division. You had a civil war, indeed. So did we. But in the north, where I come from, in Lancashire, we feel closer to Ireland than we do to the south. Now, in the south, we have London. We have Eton and Harrow and Oxford and Cambridge. We have a special kind of sector of the entire population which rules the country, which provides the country with a way of speaking, because the way the Queen speaks is Southeast English. And the government is carried on there, the big universities, the public schools are there, and we resent it. And one aspect of this resentment occurred a few years ago when the Beatles appeared. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Beatles are great artists. They probably were. I don't know what's happened to them now. But I remember when the Beatles appeared, I was asked by the editor of the New York magazine to write an article in which I presented the Beatles as the new four evangelists. I said I wouldn't go as far as that. But the Beatles did this. They did show the world, and show America particularly, that there was another way of speaking English. And it's the way that I was brought up. You speak like this, right? Like Ringo Starr. Right, like the Maharishi, he knows his onions. Like he tell you to get like with the Atma and the Mahatma, and like just purge off your fleshly endowments and get in touch with the spirit. This is the way they speak in Lancashire. But if you try to get into a university in England or even in America and give a lecture on Shakespeare and began like this, like lads, today we're going to have a look at William Shakespeare, who was born in 1564 and died in 1616, and we're going to have a look at some of his plays, they'd laugh at you.
Yes.
Because the accent is no longer associated with scholarship, with learning, or with government. It's merely associated with comedy.
Yeah.
And this is something we in the north of England feel very strongly about. It doesn't matter what they do. I mean, Peter Brook's gone pretty far, God knows, in Midsummer Night's Dream here, but as long as they keep the language, that's all that matters. Because that language is what made us, English and American alike. The language has been made by that particular man, that man with no education, that man with just a tremendous imagination, who was prepared to invent words, use words in new ways, and build up a tremendous vocabulary that we're living off now. Spyro Agnew, God knows whether you know Shakespeare or not, but he's living off Shakespeare, as the rest of us are. He made the English language, and that's the biggest inheritance we've got. We can, when the moon probes, when the moon landings are forgotten, when the Vietnam adventure is forgotten, when the principles of democracy are forgotten, the English language will remain. It's ours.
But who will be here?
English speakers.
Have you ever had a mental block where you couldn't write, though? Is that a temporary thing, or are you always got...
No, well, I started writing very late. You see, I spent a good number of years of my life trying to be a composer of music. My family had been a musical family. My father had been a cinema pianist. In the old days when he was fired from the job because he played inappropriate music to a religious film.
What, for example?
Well, it was the Last Supper, and he played for "He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Well, he used to be under the screen. He never saw the film before it was actually shown, and he used to improvise the music as he went along. And
he didn't know what was
well,
up
he
there?
saw a table with people around it, and they were drinking, and he thought it was a kind of stag reunion, and he played this. Anyway, the point is that I tried to be a composer for many years, you see, and it was only when I was about 38, which is pretty old by today's standards, that I envied these people who merely just typed out one line, and that was prose or poetry, whereas when you're writing music, you had about 24 lines to the page, you know, flutes, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, all the way down, and you had to fill all these in. And by the time you'd spent about 6 or 7 hours on a single page, you'd produce about 3 seconds worth of music. And then you had to copy the parts out and persuade a conductor to get his orchestra to play, and you had one performance, and that was it. So writing seemed a much easier task, and I began to write as a kind of hobby, and then became a professional writer.
Is there any reason why...
So I started late, you see, and
Yeah.
so there's, you know, the things that I would have got rid of by the time I was 38, I still have in front of me. It's as simple as that.
Things you'd have gotten rid of.
The things I would have written by the time I was 38 still have to be written.
What do you think about a writer going into psychoanalysis?
I think it's shocking. I think it's a ghastly thing. The psychoanalysts will take all the creative energy out. I have a student at Princeton who is taking analysis, and he can't write anything. He just sits there, not bemused, zombified, and all this great creative guilt is being sucked out of him once a week in New York. And he can't use this guilt. You see, writers have to be guilty. We've got to feel guilty about everything, and this guilt provides a dynamo, and this dynamo charges the creative act, so that every time you sit down and write a book, you're shedding your guilt about people, about the world, or whatever it is. And once you get rid of this guilt and become a happy person, you're no longer an artist. It's a kind of demon. Once you start on this creative kick, you're landed with it. It's there all the time, and you're not happy unless you are writing. You're wretched while you're writing. You're miserable as hell, but there's nothing else you can do. You can't read anybody else's work because you think, well, I could have written it this way. You can't go to the movies, or you think, well, I would have made it this way. You can't listen to music because words get in the way, and you just end up by being only happy possibly when you're making love, drinking, or writing.
Those things don't take your creative urge away.
Not quite in that order. Well, yes. Well, no, not simultaneously. They're on the same level. They're on the same level of pleasure and creativity.
We had 2 questions. One of them, a lady down here asked if they call a mouse a moose, what do they call a mouse?
If they call a mouse a moose, you mean what do they call a moose? What do they call it? They call it a moose. You know, the two O's were pronounced as a long O. You see. Oh, they call the moon, M-O-O-N, mourn. It's a bit slower and there's less smog. They got rid of the smog in London in the 1950s because the Smithfield Cattle Show was held during a period of very bad smog, and most of the prize exhibits suffocated. And the British are very fond of animals. And so they brought in their, no, it is true, they brought in their smoke abatement law. So London is a fairly clear city. Otherwise, there's a little less mugging, rather less mugging. You get your drugs free at midnight at a chemist shop, a drugstore in Piccadilly Circus. If you're hooked and can't be unhooked, you get your drugs on the National Health Service scheme. And on the whole, it's a lot quieter. It's a big city. It's fairly gay, but the pace is rather slower in London than it is here.
You mentioned last time that you moved here because you could work better here, whereas some people are moving to England because they want the quiet. You like the excitement.
There's far less excitement in London than there is in New York, without any doubt. The excitement resides mostly in the arts. It's mostly in theatre, for instance. The young are as excitable and as interesting as they are in America. Indeed, they copy Americans a great deal of the time. But London's a big vertical city, whereas this is a great, I beg your pardon, big horizontal city. This is a great perpendicular city. You have the sensation of space in London. And there's a lot of public transport, which is a good thing, and the underground, the subway, is far better run than the New York subway. It's far cleaner and far safer. You can walk out at night. You can walk out at 3 or 4 in the morning with a fair certainty of not getting mugged, or if you're a woman, of not getting raped. Which is something.
Yes. think you'd have to say that. You can walk out here, but the certainty is
Yes,
not...
yes. Well, I wrote this book in 1960. That's a hell of a long time ago now, when there was nothing like the violence in New York or any other city on the scale that we have it now. But I wasn't thinking of London. I wasn't thinking of an English city at all. I was thinking of a purely imaginary city, which could be either in the Western Hemisphere or in the Eastern. In effect, it could be either America or Russia. It was a composite city, and I had composite teenagers beating people up. It was not meant to be a photograph of life as it was lived in London. The time when I wrote the book, we had a fair amount of violence, but it was done in a kind of gentlemanly way. We had the mods versus the rockers. It wasn't a question of the mods and the rockers combining to beat up the old. The mods and the rockers beat up each other, which was reasonable. And we had teddy boys who were fairly smart. They dressed a little like John Steed in the Avengers. And they were too concerned with keeping their clothes clean to become involved in too much violence. It wasn't as violent then, when I wrote the book, as it is now here. There was violence everywhere, but rather less violence in London than there is in America. And it's something to do with drugs, of course.
Do you accept the speech here for what it is, American, or do you find it just a bastardization of the proper English?
To put it nicely.
No, this is good English speech. This has as much, any kind of American speech has as much claim to be regarded as real English as the English the Queen of England speaks herself. And incidentally, she speaks a dialect 100 years old. She's not up to date at all in her English. American English is a little old-fashioned in its sounds, remember, because the sounds are those spoken 300 or 400 years ago. But American English is very creative. It's always making new forms. It's very, very quick to find a new term, a new phrase, a new slang phrase or idiom for a new phase of social change or a new invention. And this is what I admire about English. In England, in England, we tend to be a little conservative about inventing things. And when we want to take over a new word, we usually take it from America. And we're always a bit late in taking it. That is why we sound old-fashioned.